In the last episode, we discovered the origins of Japan's budding warrior class. Born in an age of strife, a grand army of the Yamato, sometimes referred to as the Ritsuryo army, had been forged, manned by conscripts throughout the many provinces and led by aristocratic officials. Yet it was a product of its time, and as we saw, soon outlived its usefulness, as by the close of the 38-year war against the northern Emishi, we came to see the state more heavily relying on an emerging class of professional fighters. Now, as we press deeper into the Heian period, Japan's classical era, we will continue to chart the rise of this new warrior culture, as great warrior families will begin to surface, and prominent warlords will even come to challenge the weakening authority of the emperor. As we tread into the early years of the Heian period, the old order was shifting. In the countryside, groups of professional fighters banding together had supplanted the old imperial Ritsuryo army as a more effective military force. And to this, provincial elites of the middle and lower central aristocracy began to steadily militarize as well. It was the eve of a new warrior class and culture. As we had discussed previously, the rise of this group of professional fighters, who have at times been likened to mercenaries, was in all truth a far more efficient answer to the previous question of nationwide security. Although the old conscript army of the Yamato had proven effective in the 38-year war against the northern Emishi tribes, elsewhere throughout Japan they had become mired in corruption, misuse, and other detriments. The recruitment of private groups of warriors solved this issue, and steadily began to rise throughout the end of the Nara period and into the Heian period. It was an all too easy answer, but ultimately one which would, in time, come to be cataclysmic to the imperial state. Now, in the capital of Heian-kyo, our modern-day Kyoto, great change was also arriving. The Taika reforms, which had sought to strengthen Japan's governing systems by implementing concepts from Tang China, had proven to be a successful process. The government now functioned in a more orderly manner. Besides the war with the Emishi, which saw steady victories, for the rest of Japan, it was a time of great peace and stability. Yet, despite this, the imperial state itself was soon enough going to weaken, which begs the question of why. One answer that has been touted argues that the deterioration of the imperial state begins with general stagnation. Although much of Japan's governing systems of the time had been lifted from China, both Japan and China found themselves in quite different conditions. Whereas China both sought to defend its borders and expand, Japan had no borders or frontiers after the north had been conquered. Additionally, unlike China, Japan had not experienced what has been described as a social revolution. Japanese elites did not require a state-orientated bureaucracy based on merit, but instead still relied on birth as the primary means of separating the masses and by which positions were acquired. Family and status were everything at this time. Thus, eventually, we come to see the rise of some truly significant houses, the most important of which in this early age coming to be the famed Fujiwara. The Fujiwara were descended from Fujiwara no Kamatari, a name you might remember from the prior episode. Originally, his family name had been Nakatomi, and he had been an instrumental figure of the Taika reforms. His close association to Emperor Tenji, who initiated the reforms, meant that his house was to become quite intertwined with that of the emperor and court for many generations to come. Throughout the Nara and Heian periods, the Fujiwara would come to hold positions of great prominence, either as higher bureaucrats or even advisors to the imperial throne. In time, they had even begun to intermarry with the imperial family, thus securing far greater status, including near complete control over the court. R.H.P. Mason and J.G. Kager, in their book on the history of Japan, detail how the Fujiwara continued to extend their grip over the government. When an emperor reached an age to rule in his own right, his regent would take the alternative title of Kampaku and continue to direct affairs. The Fujiwara saw to it that further marriages would perpetuate their power. Reigning emperors had to marry daughters or sisters of the Fujiwara chief, and often could be persuaded to abdicate as soon as these unions produced sons. This marriage policy could be operated all the more easily because it was customary for high-ranking persons to have several wives, and because there was no clear law that the eldest son should automatically succeed to the throne. Skillfully enforced, it kept the Fujiwara supreme for 2 not inglorious centuries. So, while in Kyoto the Fujiwara had for the most part all but stripped power away from the emperor himself, in the provinces throughout the early Heian period we also start to chart another significant shift. As we have already discussed previously, the government was complacent to the rise of local groups of professional warriors in the countryside who took over military affairs from the outdated Ritsuryu army, which had since been disbanded by the late 8th century. With this also came the obvious rise of significant warrior leaders, whose own status was linked directly to their own prestige and alliances. These leaders were increasingly delegated assignments by local elites, and in turn, they were able to rely on their own chain of subordinates. Eventually, a web of connections between warrior groups spread across the country. It was a network which was utilized to amass larger forces of fighting men when needed. In general, these warrior gangs were by no means large, often consisting of less than 50 men, with several mounted and many others on foot. Yet, their true strength in numbers would factor in more due to their alliances which could be called upon, as mustered forces consisting of many warrior groups would start to form up into more of what we can begin to consider an army. What was incredibly important was that these groups and their alliances remained hierarchical, as those who took upon a more lateral approach often fell victim to internal strife. Warrior leaders with greater prestige, of course, came to sit atop increasingly mighty networks of power, serving as beacons by which other warrior groups rallied to in an area. And this is where I believe we should perhaps tread into the topic of terminology. Remembering back to the prior episode, I was cautious not to jump into using the term bushi just yet, as the origins of the term itself are a bit more complicated and even obscure. The term bushi itself is generally thought to have emerged during the 10th century, yet there are varying theories as to how it arose. Its actual definition can be tricky depending on the translation of the kanji used, but generally it can be read as a martial, scholar, or gentleman. Regardless of its origins, however, these early warrior groups we just discussed have been described as bushi themselves. Yet, although it seems we can apply the term here, it is important to note that what a bushi was in actual effect is something that changed and shifted over the ages. In terms of these early warrior groups, what appears to be a defining factor is a collection of armed fighters outside of direct government control. Essentially, as we have talked about, private warrior groups of the provinces. We can equate these men to bushi in these early times. However, eventually the rise in power of these professional fighters led to provincial elites militarizing themselves as well, as to advance their own ambitions. The prestige that came with amassing recognition for one's martial skill and soldiering was something that elites throughout the countryside could not ignore. Militarized provincial elites, who were of the provincial governing class and who resided primarily in Kyoto, have become known more widely as Miyako no Musha, warriors of the capital. These Miyako no Musha sought to work with higher nobility as a vehicle for further advancement, serving as bodyguards or police, as well as in the countryside to enforce the will of certain influential aristocrats. Now, some of you might be thinking that the roles just described for the Miyako no Musha seem to match up quite well with what our early idea of the samurai were. The term samurai would be derived from its root, saburao, which meant to attend or to follow. Today, we define the actual term samurai as meaning more broadly as someone who serves. Yet these Miyako no Musha are by no means to be confused with lower warriors who would simply be referred to as someone who serves. They may have even found the idea insulting. Remember, the Miyako no Musha were men of the provincial governing class. By all means, they were higher than regular run-of-the-mill provincial warriors. Bushi were certainly seen as lower than them, and the same was true for Bushi who became seen as samurai, those who had begun to serve in the capital as bodyguards and enforcers for court nobles. This is perhaps where much confusion regarding terminology begins for terms like samurai. Whereas today, due to its more broad Edo period usage, we tend to describe most Japanese warriors as samurai retroactively. In truth, the origin showcases how, although all samurai were bushi, not all bushi were samurai, and not all high-ranking warriors were perhaps seen as either of the two. Over the course of the 9th century and into the 10th century, the warriors of the capital continued to grow in power, but their advancement was unique. You see, they didn't just work with higher-ranking nobles for any reason. It was specific. They did so because they needed to if they were to achieve anything at all. This was because their own ambitions were curtailed by the rigidity of Heian society. They could only grow their own influence so far by themselves. Historian Carl Friday puts it likely into the best phrasing when he says, "The rights and privileges of each stratum were barred from below as well as from above. That is, scions of the top court families were as effectively barred from assuming district and local government posts as provincial elites were from becoming top court officials. This formed the basis for vertical cooperation between members of different strata, because neither party could effectively challenge the prerogatives of the other. That is, social disparity contributed to the solidarity of vertical factions, because each member of the alliance could aid the other in obtaining rewards for which he himself was ineligible." The Miyako no Musha were growing stronger. Their ability to militarize and in some cases dominate their provincial landholdings made them formidable forces, effectively warrior houses. For example, branches of the prominent Fujiwara had militarized, specifically the northern Hokke branch. Yet the two most famous of these houses to emerge were obviously that of the Heike and Genji, more commonly known today as the Taira and Minamoto. Both of these families were descended from prior emperors and had in time been granted their new surnames. Throughout various branches, they had spread across Japan as provincial elites and would establish reputations as warriors of great renown. However, the branches of their families were by no means unified. Although many may have shared a family name, bonds between siblings were weak compared to bonds between fathers and sons. Thus, opposition and conflict between branches was a frequent occurrence. But perhaps one of the greatest stories of early conflict involving these budding warrior clans was that of the rebellion of a certain Taira no Masakado. Masakado was born sometime around the year 903. He was the grandson of Taira no Takamochi, who himself was the grandson of Emperor Kanmu. Takamochi was the first to be granted the surname of Taira, yet his fame is overshadowed by the many prominent Taira lords who would later come to rise. Masakado, his grandson, was one such name. Masakado had become a prominent Miyako no Musha of his time, working in the capital with a powerful Fujiwara politician by the name of Fujiwara no Tarahira. Being able to only advance his status so far in Kyoto, and with the death of his father, by the early 930s, Masakado had returned home to the Kanto region, where it seems he was beset by rivals. Masakado would fend off threats from both members of the Taira and Minamoto, battling his foes to defend his territory in Shimosa. In Kyoto, these conflicts were seen as nothing more than inter-family squabbles, nothing major or potentially harmful to the state as a whole. Yet after defeating a rival coalition along the border of Hitachi, Masakado was even said to have been called back to the capital in 936 to explain his position on the wars in the Kanto. The court must have seen he was no menace at the time, and he was later allowed to leave. Still, the contests persisted. It is not entirely known what galvanized Masakado into full rebellion. Certainly for a time, he understood that his wars appeared legitimate and were often the cause of others challenging him. Rather, they are but a piece of the puzzle, and historians have yet to agree on what fully pushed him over the edge and to eventually challenge the actual state. From disputes over women, to lords trying to seize his land, to his friends and allies being threatened, to perhaps his wife and children being captured by rivals. What matters is that by 939, he finally revolted, marching his forces across the border into Hitachi and capturing the province. As Friday states, by this point he had crossed the proverbial line. No longer could the court view him as simply a powerful provincial warrior at odds with local rivals. His capture of a provincial government headquarters had put him in rebellion against the state. From here, Masakado pushed forth, knowing there was no going back, and in a short amount of time, he had acquired a massive swath of territory, from Kazusa and Awa, to Shimotsuke, to Musashi, Kotsuke, Sagami, and Izu. All across the Kanto, the banner of Taira no Masakado flew high. Masakado would proclaim himself the new and rightful emperor, which perhaps he held some case for, with the Taira being descended from Emperor Kanmu after all. He even began construction on a new imperial capital. Yet, fate was not to be on Masakado's side for long. Despite his rapid military success and his conquering of the region, an imperial edict from Kyoto had promptly declared him an enemy of the state and had rallied significant warriors to the cause. This was to truly be Japan's first major military conflict, completely involving private armies of professional warriors. On the 14th day of the second month of 940, the punishment of heaven descended upon Masakado. As he squared off against the government forces in northwestern Shimosa, his horse forgot how to gallop as the wind in flight. The man lost all his martial skills. Struck by an arrow from the gods, in the end, the new emperor perished alone, like Shi Yi battling on the plains of Cholu. And as Masakado's life came to an end, thus began the famous story of his head. According to legend, after Masakado's head was taken and sent back to Kyoto for all to see, for a time it sat on display at Shichijogawara, yet its look was ominous, appearing to still be alive and enraged. Until finally, one wicked night, howling with laughter and anger, it flew off on its own into the sky, streaking back east to find his body and continue the fight. Today in Tokyo, you can still visit where it is said Masakado's head landed. Of course, the rebellion of Taira no Masakado was not to be the only major insurrection as the new warrior class increased in power. During the 900s, around the same time as Masakado's rebellion, the government also had to contend with Fujiwara no Sumitomo, who would become a villainous pirate leader. Yet he too would be cut down by forces sent from the court in 941. But the conflicts did not stop there. The growing warrior culture bred violence, as military leaders and bushi sought continued means to further their prestige and power. Throughout the remainder of the 10th century and into the 11th, warrior families continued to amass influence and clash. It was truly the dawn of a new age, as the rise of private warrior groups had snowballed into a culture and class that would continue to take Japan by storm, militarizing their society, engaging in heated feuds, and at times challenging the imperial government, slowly chipping away at the established order. The rise of what we today would call the samurai class was at hand. But as you can see, terminology at the time was not so simple. Instead, the simplest way we can describe this period is to say that Japanese society was becoming dominated by warriors. In the next episode, we will focus on the Hogen and Heiji rebellions, two significant clashes fought throughout the streets of Kyoto, and ones which are seen as the prelude to the legendary Genpei War. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell if you enjoyed this video and found it to be most informative.